Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, and he is a real life doctor. He's not one of those silly PhDs who feign at being a doctor, but in all seriousness, he is an expert on health, performance, and all things barbell medicine. So, Jordan, how are we doing today?
I'm doing great. Also, no hate comms to PhDs or to other non-clinical doctors. I respect you and your education, your academic prowess. You run circles around me with research design or whatever your field of expertise is. So just peace and love. Just wanted to get that out of the way. Otherwise, yeah, doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and now I'm feeling like the bad guy on my own podcast who's
No,
going to
no, you
get,
could. Nah,
just as much love mail that I get, which might be one comment every thousand or so days. I'll get one piece of hate mail. I'll probably get it in about 6 months. Someone will randomly stumble upon this episode and feel really frustrated that I don't appreciate PhDs enough. So thank you for that, Jordan. It's a great way to start the podcast.
peace and love. Peace and love, everybody.
Peace and love. Which is actually what we want to dig into today, which is, I would say, population health and specifically the aerobic slash I always kind of go endurance aerobic just to kind of denote the cardiovascular component. We have
Sure.
a focus on kind of like you know, uh, basic fitness qualities and heart health and the things that kind of come along with that style of training. Before we get into, that topic and start to kind of funnel from, what's the purpose of it? What are the mechanisms by which it works? How would you prescribe it? And then how do you get people to carry it out? What, what were the I guess like critical moments in your life that led you to getting this into health and if we call it well-being and fitness and strength training, like that conglomerate of kind of just being fit. What got you interested in this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I have to go way back, and again, some of this is going to be revisionist history just because, I mean, I'm 40, so like the years pass by and you're like, oh, was it this year? Was it that year? And hard to know what the mindset was of like a, you know, preteen, for example. But like, I mean, you think about the culture at the time when I was growing up before adolescence. You've got Hulk Hogan, you've got Arnold Schwarzenegger, you've got Sylvester Stallone, and these action movies and whatever, and sort of like this, hyper masculine. Yeah, and that's part of, maybe you call it Americana, maybe you call it a cultural shift in that, late 80s, early 90s, that sort of time. But yeah, you wanted to be big and strong. And whatever. I didn't really work out. We didn't have any exercise equipment at my place, but I just, that probably seeded something in my brain about like, yeah, if you're, a man and you got to have muscles and whatever. But I didn't actually lift any weights formally or do any sort of like exercise until I got more serious about my motocross career. And so that was in my teens. And I knew that I needed to have on the bike fitness, which was at the time, the major thinking was, look, you can ride a lot. You should do that. And if you lift weights, you're probably going to get, for lack of a better phrase, they call it muscle bound, right? Whatever that, it'd be hard to define that, but nobody was really doing resistance training at that time for motocross. And that included me. Then I dislocated my hip in a race, and I couldn't really walk for the better part of 3 months. I was in this weird sort of brace to make sure that things kind of like set themselves up, and I, didn't have any complications. And after I was cleared to get out of the brace, I had a limp. 18 years old, walking around with a limp, and the home physical therapist basically came over and made me do sits to stands from the couch. And she was she was like, look, you got to go to the gym, you got to get stronger, you got to get your legs stronger so you don't have a limp. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll just go play around with that. So that was kind of like my initiation into the gym. I had no idea what I was doing. Fortunately, I had a friend who was a like pretty high level wrestler at both the state level and then in high school and then in college. And he kind of, took me through some stuff. It wasn't great instruction. It wasn't great programming. It was, the typical stuff that people in high school would do. You bench press, you do some pull ups, you do some curls. We did some leg press, but like we never squatted or deadlifted or anything like that. But that's how I got into this sort of scene. And then I liked it a lot. And at the time, you think about 2003, that's when I graduated high school. Um, the internet was a different place. And so if you were like strength training, invariably you're going to end up at a handful of places. One of the most common might have been like Deep Squatter from Dave Tate, and Elite FTS. And so you would end up on these sites, and it's talking about all powerlifting stuff. And for them, powerlifting was a sumo deadlift, a wide stance squat to maybe not quite USAPL or IPF standards or whatever. And that's how I got into doing the big three, and ultimately ended up competing a few years later, got bit by the powerlifting bug. And yeah, I mean, I know this podcast is going to go into more about conditioning, cardio, and, I'll be happy to discuss that. But that was not a big part of my training for many, many years. Not because I thought like it wouldn't be beneficial. I was just more concerned
Yeah.
that it would compete with, adaptations that I was going to get from strength training. And so the only time I would do cardio is if like spring break was coming up. And I was like, all right, well, maybe I want to get a little leaner, in college. But yeah, it was not a big part of my training. And so that has been like an evolution, not only from like a health sort of standpoint, concerns about, health, longevity, health span, things of that nature, but also actually for like work capacity. So during a training, like how much training can you do in a single session before you're too fatigued to have any high quality type efforts, right? And then also for like recovery, just my view on it now is that you need a certain level of like baseline fitness, right? And part of that's certainly going to be cardiorespiratory fitness in order to sustain relatively high volumes of training for a extended period of time. And ultimately, the more work that you can complete and recover from, the more fitness you're likely to obtain. And so, yeah, I've made a concerted effort probably since 2018, 2017, something like that, to do a lot more conditioning, not only than what I was previously doing, but what most powerlifters or strength athletes would probably be apt to otherwise perform. And so it's not unusual for me now to do, 5 to 7+ hours a week of just straight up conditioning. And I'm not an endurance athlete. Like that's not what I'm doing. It's more so that's what I'm doing for my endurance work, my cardiorespiratory fitness sort of development. And I'd probably be doing less now, to be honest, if I had a long history of doing it and my baseline was much higher for much longer. But I still feel like I'm needing to build a little bit before I can maybe make a decision to, okay, I'll do a little bit less and just maintain. I just feel like I needed to build a little bit more.
Yeah. And hopefully the PhDs listening put down the torches and
Yeah.
pitchforks, because most people who are kind of in our space end up pursuing that as a means of kind of asking and answering questions related to performance or health. And that seems like a logical kind of like extension of I'm interested in the stuff. I need a career in it. I can coach, which means I'm a business owner or gym owner, or I can get into academia, and I can get into studying training and understanding it. And I think that's a route a lot of my colleagues and friends take. So shout out to everyone who's been on the podcast who's a PhD, who's gotten that kind of along the way of me knowing them.
Totally.
But you ended up pursuing medical school and becoming an MD. And the most interesting thing, in my opinion, is that you don't really use it, in the clinic, so to speak, day to day. You run Barbell Medicine, and I'm sure it has a very strong kind of through line in how you operate and the business you actually conduct, but it isn't the sole focus. So what was the interest in going that route instead of the more kind of quote unquote traditional PhD route that most of us will take?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have that curiosity where like a research based PhD would have been, rewarding for me, like from an intellectual standpoint. But I was pretty poor growing up, man, and simple fact, I was running a gym at the time. Had a great mentor who was a spine surgeon, and he was like, "Dude, you got to go to medical school. Like, your brain is made for this." And I did have an interest in it, and so I was like, "Look, I want to learn more. I want a bigger fund of knowledge. And if I had to pick for like a career, what to do for my livelihood, if I'm not going to do this gym thing, anymore, at least that's not going to be my solo act. I wanted to be like interacting with patients in a
Mm.
clinical setting.
Yeah.
And so I didn't see a way to do that via a PhD. Now, maybe if my mentor was a PhD, maybe things would have ended up differently, or maybe if I was in a different situation, as far as like career wise, maybe I would have done something different. But yeah, it seemed pretty clear to me like, okay, med school checks the like intellectual curiosity box. I get to deal with people in a clinical setting, feel like I'm helping, and the skill set to me was more attractive. Again, for me personally. And so going through medical school, oh man, I had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun in clinical rotations, and it wasn't until towards the end of medical school when I was making decisions about residency and what I was going to do that I kind of had made up my mind that I probably wasn't going to practice as a regular physician, it's from of my full-time gig. I thought I would do some clinical care, which is, so either whether it's telemedicine, volunteer work or whatever. And that's kind of still the case. But I really couldn't find a good place for myself as far as I want to do this every day. And so like sports medicine was appealing, but most primary care, so non-operative, non-surgical sports medicine docs, don't do that full time. They'll have like a couple days a week, maybe of a sports medicine clinic. And it's a lot of joint injections typically and whatever, which, hey, again, no hate comms. Like that's maybe another podcast, but ultimately was not really fulfilling for what I wanted to do. So I kind of carved out my own little niche here. I get to do some public health stuff, like public, whether it's health ed for fitness professionals, medical professionals. I also get to deal with folks mostly from like pain and injury rehab stuff from a medical side, but also, a lot of my clients and people we work with at Barbell Medicine have some sort of medical condition that, for the most part, probably don't require a higher level of knowledge to deal with. For example, a person with run-of-the-mill high blood pressure, you don't really need specialized sort of a doctor, coach, person to help you out. You're a good strength and conditioning professional can certainly fulfill that. But we get some weird stuff too, and it's kind of nice to be able to ride the fence there and be like, okay, yeah, I've got my one foot in my on my doctor side, one foot on my coaching side, and bring those together. So that's all rewarding. So, yeah, I don't use it from like as far as seeing 20 patients a day. I don't do that, but I am appreciative that I had the opportunity to get that fund of knowledge, get those clinical skills, and now I get to kind of use them mostly in a public health sort of setting, but also some practical hands-on in the trenches type work too, which I really like.
Yeah, it's hard not to have this podcast veer off into unnecessary territory because there's just so many things to pick up and talk about.
Sure.
One of the most important ones that I think distinguishes barbell medicine from your, it sounds degrading, run-of-the-mill kind of like S&C performance, company business gym, is the focus on health, and the focus on health over, I'd say generally over just sole performance. It's like, hey, maybe consider this stuff too, and this should also be an aspect of your training. So we'll talk about like the more of the cardio side of it. It's like, don't it be to your detriment to neglect this. It's a very critical component, and I think that's a message I hear conveyed often. And I'd be curious to know why that's been such an important part of the way barbell medicine operates since it started.
Yeah. No, it's just hard to take that doctor hat off, right? Like imagine, and you can make the analogy, imagine you're a lawyer, right? And you hear something from like a casual conversation with a friend or peer group or whatever, and you're like, this kind of triggers my judicial jurisprudence sort of senses. Like that feel like there's either a case here or there's some statute, whatever. It's the same thing with medicine. You hear somebody's talking about exercise, and then maybe some decisions that they're making around that have some maybe unappreciated risks because either things are missing, like cardio, for example, or they have a medical condition that otherwise would require maybe some specific considerations in exercise. It's just hard to take that doctor hat off, right? Can't just like ignore it. And so once you've been exposed to that, it's really challenging to like blind yourself or turn that off. And so I think just due to the it's pretty unique. Dr. Baraki and myself, or, there's only a handful of us like Dr. Powerlifter folks, Eli Burke and Chris Hunt and what Donovan Thompson. They're all physicians and competitive powerlifters, and I believe Donovan does some coaching, but Eli Burke and Chris Hunt are full time physicians. So yeah, I would be curious to know if they have a similar sort of sense where they're like, man, it's really hard for us to like talk about exercise, talk about even if it's just strength training, and then not keep like one foot in their doctor world and think, maybe there's some crossover there. So yeah, it's just whatever your previous experiences were in life and your education and exposure to stuff. I do think that colors how you interpret a problem or a question or whatever. And so, yeah, almost naturally, I can't turn it off. And so ultimately arrive in this sort of niche where it's like this crossover between medicine and fitness, which fortunately I think should be pretty closely aligned.
Yeah.
We need healthcare professionals to have at least some semblance of like what a good fitness professional is capable of, and like there needs to be some crosstalk there. And fitness professionals similarly need to have some sort of insight into various aspects of medicine, because if you work with enough people, they're going to have some sort of medical condition, and you can't just stare blankly at them and blink a lot. So there needs to be some sort of crossover, and I think ultimately we're bridging that gap, and I feel fortunate to have the opportunity to do so.
Yeah. And I know the influence I'll say received from Barbell Medicine has been more of a focused on kind of like the person versus the performance. And, saying, someone may be saying like, oh, I'm in a heavier weight class, like super heavyweight. I don't feel great. I've been told maybe I should move down. Like, what do you think as a coach to an athlete? And it's like, yeah, that's probably something important to consider if health is a priority or something that matters to you. Not just total. And I think that influence itself, like my ability to articulate that, has been a byproduct of Barbell Medicine's educational stuff.
No, we appreciate it. That's a tough call. Somebody who's like maybe they're a tall individual, right? And they like powerlifting for whatever reason. They didn't want to play a real sport. They just got into powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting, and they're like, well, what weight class should I go into? Because in both of these strength sports, we have uncapped super heavyweight divisions, meaning you can just weigh as much as you want. You're still in the super heavyweight division, and so what's the incentive is, well, if I gain weight, I'm going to get stronger and be more competitive. And it's like, yeah, but there are some costs associated with that, potentially to your health, for example. And so we have this weird interplay between this sort of social incentivization of you want to be as strong as possible. And so that's going to be mean, filling out your frame. But then some health concerns. And we're talking about people generally in their 20s. And so it's like, well, this is maybe the start of like how you steer your health trajectory, right? So, for example, if you develop high blood pressure, high fasting blood sugar, hyperlipidemia, so elevated sort of low density lipoprotein, LDL, and triglycerides, that starts in your 20s and it remains unchecked for years and years and years. That duration of exposure is quite high and can lead to a higher risk of various health conditions, whether it's, heart disease, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, etc. But again, if you're in your 20s, you're almost invincible, right? Because it's just hard. It's hard to do bad stuff to or have a bad outcome, when people are young. But we see this in a lot of other sports too, especially with related to body size. I think maybe my first introduction to this was David Epstein, the author of The Sports Gene. He wrote this article before that book came out called The Big Bang of Athletic Bodies. And so previously it was thought that like the person who was going to be best at sport had like the average proportions, the Darwinian man, average height, average wingspan, average, X, Y, and Z. Obviously that's not true, right? And so what you've seen now is that sports where height is rewarded, those folks, the trend in those sports far outpace the height changes in non-athletes in the secular population. So like in the NBA, I think the average height increase is about 4 times greater than it is in the secular, non-athletic population. In the NFL, body weights have gone, way up, particularly for linemen and such. And then you also see it on the other side in like sports where small stature is rewarded, like
Yeah.
gymnastics. So like the average BMI has been going down for years and years and years. You see the similar thing in like figure skating as well. And so to me, the summary of all that is like the big get bigger, the tall get taller, the small get smaller, the freaks get freakier, and that's all like selection based on sport and society and how those two kind of interplay. And you know, at the end of the day, at Barbell Medicine and what we do, we're kind of like, yeah, maybe we're identifying some risks that maybe people haven't thought about, or at least some strategies to maybe mitigate those risks. But yeah, anyway, I know we probably weren't supposed to go off on that tangent, but like something that has been in my brain for a bit.
Yeah. Well, I know it's been conceptualized and communicated well from Derek Miles, who's also been on the podcast, I want to say multiple times, with the quote unquote asymmetries that develop training for a sport and preparing to compete in a sport because of the biases towards certain movements, certain muscle groups, certain types of training. And it's not that those, asymmetries are bad. They're adaptive for the sport and would aid in probably performing at a higher level than trying to be balanced. The
Totally.
idea with
Yeah.
performance
What
is
is
that you're
balance?
allocating, yeah, you're trying to allocate resources toward a very specific type of improvement or change.
Yep.
And taking time away from that to put towards things that balance you out, so pushing more than you pull or pulling more, whatever, it's kind of a waste of time if you're thinking of performance in isolation. So I think that was one thing that really clicked for me, and it's like, okay, this change isn't bad, but it's specific to the outcome that we're focused on. It's not specific to anything else. So maybe in a
Yeah.
different context you might not necessarily want that change, that specific adaptation. At
Yeah.
least in access.
Yeah, there's some inflection point by which where the pursuit of performance for a particular task or set of tasks no longer becomes health promoting or even like health neutral, but is actually like
Yeah.
potentially harmful. And
Yeah.
it's challenging to even think like with a medical background to like identify that and feel confident like, oh, here, this is the line in the sand
Yeah.
that we're
Yeah.
going to draw. But I think it having some exposure, and in our case, is like a substantial amount of exposure to medicine and kind of the end state of some of these things makes us more
Wow. Yeah.
cautious, or at least more concerned with like, well, if we keep taking this further and further and further, like what are the risks, and how does that balance up with the potential incentives, right? So for our potential super heavyweight powerlifter, right, it's like, look, if you're in your 20s and this is going to be like a 5-year deal and you want to take your body weight up to 125 kilos, 135 kilos because you're real tall and you want to be real strong, like, is this really risky for a short period of time? It's like, well, that's a different consideration than if somebody gets up to 135 kilos and then stays there in perpetuity, right, with maybe a little bit of excess body fat. So anyway, I think ultimately that's how we have arrived at maybe this, we'll call it the barbell medicine method, or at least the view on like how we think about these things. Between that and then, in medicine, you evidence-based medicine is introduced early, and you're hammered. It's like, well, look, why are we making the decisions we make as far as to do an intervention, the specific type of intervention, or to just kind of watch and wait, for example? And it's like, oh, well, you got to go to the scientific evidence and look for, does a person who's generally like your patient benefit from this intervention? Or, do they need something else, or do they need really nothing? And so when you take that same sort of like training and analysis to exercise, things get a little interesting, because you're like, why do people recommend this? This is based on effectively no evidence, and of course the absence of evidence is not necessarily the same evidence of absence, all that sort of stuff. But if there's evidence suggesting that, look, making this change or making this decision doesn't do anything, well, why are people so confidently recommending this? And so, yeah, we get into some internet spats about that. And ultimately, it's kind of like we're coming at a question or a topic from different standpoints. It's like we're saying, like the character in Jerry Maguire, show me in this case, the evidence, but show me the money. Whereas others are like, this seems like a reasonably good idea. And then you kind of start asking, like, well, why? And like, well, this is how I've done it. And you're like, okay. I don't know that I would feel that strongly about that, but it's just coming at a question from two different places. So
there's a Brocky quote that comes to mind, which is, it makes sense if you don't think about it too long.
totally. Yeah. Just don't think about it. Just don't think about it. Yep.
And we're getting into the public health sphere, which is great. And there's a Daniel Dennett quote I wanted to pull up, which is what you can imagine depends on what you know. And what I'm hearing from you is that there's a lot of like you saying things play out. Therefore, you have these counterfactuals. Other people don't have those. Other people can't
Hmm.
imagine what it's like to be, to have overweight for too long, and be exposed to that for extensive periods of time. Whereas you've seen that play out from, the most mild case, the most extreme case, me putting words in your mouth. And you can then say like, "Oh, I don't know if I would actually recommend that based on what could possibly happen."
Yeah.
How do you communicate that well to people who don't have the ability to counterfactually think like, oh, if I do stay in the super heavyweight class for 10 years, there might actually be an effect later in life that I, could regret not having made a change sooner or managed my body weight sooner, all those things.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, any sort of science communication, whether it be like public facing or to an individual, it can be challenging, especially if there is a knowledge gap, but ultimately trying to identify common ground where somebody can understand what you're saying. And so sometimes that has to do with language that you select. Sometimes it has to do with, using examples and metaphors and this, that, and the other. And so it is kind of an art with respect to just communication. But I think ultimately trying to speak in a probabilistic sort of way. So if we go back to our super heavyweight example, right? If someone's like, look, what's the real risk of me staying at this body weight for, into my late 30s, for example, or into my 40s, or in forever? Like, what's the real risk of staying at this weight? And it's like, well, look, it is highly likely that if you are in the super heavyweight class, you're carrying an excess amount of body fat. And we know that this increases your risk of laundry list of diseases. And the amount of risk is directly proportional to not only how much body fat you're carrying above your personal body fat threshold, where above that increases your risk, and below that there's no risk, or less risk. There's no situation where there's really no risk. But in any case, it's directly related to the amount of body fat you're carrying, and also the duration of the exposure, where the longer exposure, again, further increases risk. And so I may not be able to put a number on that for this individual, like, oh, you have an 80% chance of developing, type 2 diabetes if you were to say like this. But I could communicate that, by saying, I have a high degree of confidence that you were at a substantially greater risk of developing this, and this if you went down this path. That doesn't mean that you're going to have a bad outcome, but ultimately comparing risks to benefits and in a way that a person can understand is likely to shape their understanding. And that's step one. Because just because somebody understands that there's a potential risk does not necessarily lead to behavior change, right? Because behavior change is more complicated. It has to do with your environment, has to do with habits, has to do with genetic, all sorts of stuff, right? And so, like, for example, 15% of the United States population still smokes. And if you were to ask them, like, hey, do you guys know that smoking's like bad for you, right? And they're like, yes. We know that it's not. And they're like, so why don't you stop? And they're like, well, it's complicated, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so step one is more so making sure the person understands and has good insight into, like, these are the potential outcomes that we're kind of looking at here, and making sure they understand that. And then the second part is identifying, are there areas where you'd be potentially willing to make a change? And identifying that kind of lets you know where somebody is in this behavior change process. There are a bunch of different models that researchers, clinicians, behaviorists use to sort of identify where somebody is in their sort of journey. I like the trans-theoretical model of behavior change. It's fine. But there are other models that are useful too. But if you identified, like, hey, look, carrying excess body fat, for example, is likely to increase your risk of various health conditions, right? And would you be potentially willing to change your exercise habits or your diet? And if someone's like, no, I'm not interested in that at all. It doesn't matter if you're the best coach, programmer, nutrition expert or whatever. That's not where the person is right now. And so rather you would need to go further down this motivational interviewing pathway and identify, like, why Are you resistant to this? Is it because of past failures? You want to do that? Is it because it's overwhelming, the idea that you would have to change these various things? Whatever, you're trying to identify sort of the obstacles and see if there's a workaround or something like that. On the other hand, if someone's like, yeah, dude, I'm ready, what do you want me to do? That person is ready for like
Yeah.
some recommendations. And so yeah, step 2 is kind of like identifying where somebody is in the behavior change sort of pathway. 3 is delivering the appropriate advice, whether that's further counseling to try to get them further along that behavior change pathway, or actually delivering an intervention that they would ideally have some sort of shared decision making. So what one thing, with respect to public health counseling around exercise and cardio, for example, people will say there's this push to get physical activity as a vital sign included into like the electronic medical record, where most physicians or healthcare providers would otherwise have to assess, like, is this person exercising, right? And so you ask them, hey, look, how many days per week are you, doing some exercise where it feels like you're working pretty hard, breathing hard, whatever. How many days per week are you doing that, and for how long? It's like, okay, that's the cardio box, right? And the second question is, how many days per week are you lifting weights or otherwise doing like calisthenics or something like that? That's the resistance training box. And so, look, that's fine, capturing that data. But you can't just go from there and say, oh, well, it looks like you're not actually doing enough cardio, so you should do at least 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous conditioning per week. Because they're like, wait, what? What does that look like? How do I do it? When you say conditioning, what does it actually mean? Like, does gardening count? Does like mowing the lawn count? Or do I have to be on a treadmill? And so, yeah, most collecting the data is one thing. But making the recommendation, that's usually a number of steps down the road, and making sure that those are understandable too. That's the kind of final step here in the with the intervention. And then the last part would be, what's their follow-up? How are you going to check in, make sure somebody's doing it, troubleshoot, and assess, like, do they actually need more exercise, less exercise, a different type of exercise? So yeah, that's kind of the general process here. But yeah, a lot of pitfalls along the way there, and can get pretty hairy.
Yeah, and I know that the audience listening to this podcast is full of, probably this episode specifically is full of coaches, athletes, people who have very entrenched habits relating to physical activity, resistance training, and maybe even cardio. And the bulk focus has been strength power training. So
Totally.
lifting weights quickly and slowly and through full ranges, or, in partial ranges. Less so has been a focus on the cardio component. And the way I generally approach these topics, out of the way my mind works, is having some sort of like mechanistic understanding of, like, why does this thing have an impact? What does it change? How does it change it? Why are those changes meaningful? And then it's more kind of like, okay, let's get closer to the prescriptive side. Let's get closer to, the programming side. And then, kind of moving, I guess, from most basic, or from most complex to most simple, most theoretical to most applied. So with cardio, why is that useful in the first place, beyond just lifting weights? Because I think a lot of people say, well, I lift weights, so I probably don't need to do anything else.
Yeah. No, that's a so just one thing that's, before we kind of dive into this, I think it's kind of interesting that, like, there's this, it's emerging to no longer be like a subculture in the, we'll call it just like the physical enthusiast space. But like, if you go back to the 70s, that's when the Cooper Institute in Texas kind of started. And Dr. Kenneth Cooper is, the guy who started basically the cardio craze in the United States, right? Whereas other countries, particularly like Eastern Bloc countries, were more focused on strength power sports, right? So in America, since the 70s, we've been like pretty cardio heavy, whereas resistance training, strength sports, et cetera, have been kind of like a subculture, maybe even a counterculture, right? And so it's like, if you were a power lifter in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, whatever, kind of like fringe. And so
Yeah.
I don't know. And now it's kind of like shifting a little bit. There's like more interest in strength training, which I think it's cool. But it does strike me as maybe something that's interesting, that the people who got into resistance training, strength sports were originally kind of fringe, again, counterculture. And so is there some resistance to engaging in doing conditioning in these folks because they're like, oh no, that's mainstream. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. Anyway, that's just a weird thought that I've had. But yeah, I think the easiest way to understand this is that the body is highly plastic. And I don't mean that from a microplastics or a nanoplastic type setting. Like invariably, we are becoming more plastic due to that, and maybe that's another podcast. But but we are highly adaptable to what is asked of our body. Effectively, we do not know the upper bounds of what we can adapt to, and that it can be positive or negative, so maladaptive, right? And so the way we adapt and sort of the end state that we arrive at is kind of the sum of what we're asking our bodies to do. And so with respect to exercise, whatever the rate limiting step or the demand, the sort of bottleneck, that determines the type of adaptations that you're going to get from exercise. In resistance training, it's force production. Right? Can your muscles produce force? Some neuromuscular excitability type stuff, coordination, all that sort of stuff. That is distinctly different than cardio, which is the circulatory system's ability to deliver energy, remove waste products, and ultimately oxygenate active muscle tissues for extended periods of time. And so you do not get those types of adaptations from resistance training, broadly speaking. Yes, if someone has a low level of cardiorespiratory fitness and they start a sort of resistance training program, pretty much any type of resistance training program, yep, they're going to see some improvement in cardiorespiratory fitness to some degree. However, it is not enough for the vast majority of folks to sort of optimize their health trajectory. They will not develop a quote like a VO2 max, for example, that is commensurate with longevity from resistance training alone. Now, there's going to be a small group of people who were just born, built differently. And I don't mean that like they were built incorrectly. They were built in a way where they just have a naturally high VO2 max, a lot of lungs, a lot of conditioning. And so, yeah, they may not actually benefit from doing a bunch of extra conditioning. Maybe they just need to do a little bit to maintain it into as they age. Whereas other folks are, built in the opposite fashion where they do not have a relatively high baseline level of cardiorespiratory fitness, and those folks need a lot more cardio. We know from large sets of data that there's a dose-dependent relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness, which can be measured by VO2 max, for example. There's a lot of different ways to measure it. That's one way. There's a dose-dependent relationship between the amount of cardiorespiratory fitness that somebody has and their risk of heart disease. So the higher somebody's cardiorespiratory fitness is, the lower their risk of heart disease. And that's not a linear relationship, but it continues to climb regardless of what level of cardiorespiratory fitness that you're talking about. And that's just for a singular disease. Have other data sets suggesting that the higher level of cardiorespiratory fitness also decreases the risk of type 2 diabetes or the burden of disease from folks with diabetes, both types. Same thing for cancer risk. And it's not that it's the same amount of risk reduction, but ultimately, when you think about the major sort of mortality risks that people are going to face as they age, so we're talking about heart disease primarily, cancer risk, things like that, metabolic dysfunction. Higher levels of cardiorespiratory fitness decrease the risk of all of those things. And despite being a meathead and wanting and recognizing that far more people need to start lifting weights right now than need to start doing cardio, far few people are lifting weights compared to doing cardio. But in any case, despite that, I do think that doing enough conditioning to sort of maximize the amount of cardiorespiratory fitness you can build with the time that you have available to you is ultimately going to be health promoting for folks and might have the fringe benefit of like actually improving your performance from a recovery standpoint, from a work capacity standpoint. And so, yeah, I think that the people listening to this likely would benefit from doing more cardio in their training program, which I don't know that anybody would. I don't think that's a controversial opinion. It's just that you're doing, if you train every week for, let's call it 8 hours a week, and you are an Olympic weightlifter or a power lifter or other strength enthusiast, I'm going to guess that 90% of that time is towards lifting weights.
Yeah.
Muscular force production, neuromuscular excitability, coordination, things of that nature. You're not getting a lot of exposure to, wow, I'm really forcing my circulatory system to work hard to deliver oxygenated blood to my active muscle tissues for extended periods of time. It's like, well, they're two different sort of asks of the body. And because of that, they're generating two disparate two different sets of adaptations. It doesn't mean that they interfere with each other. You can have both. That interference effect, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, is not really a concern of mine. It's just that the type of exercise that you do determines the type of adaptations that you're going to get, and you got to do both. I don't know what to tell you. It's like somebody who wants to jump higher or improve their high velocity force production, but is unwilling to do anything fast. And you're like, yeah, you're going to get some benefit from doing heavy, slow resistance training, but you'd get more
Yeah.
if you actually expose yourself to the thing that you're trying to improve. And so that's the way I feel about this. If you want more cardiorespiratory fitness, you got to do the conditioning. There's no real way around it. No biological free lunches here.
Yeah. And I think you provided good context by saying, for the most part, most people are probably doing
Yep.
more cardio-based physical activity than resistance training. As I mentioned, I had Dr. Michael Roberts on the podcast, and we talked about muscle's role in aging well. Beyond skeletal muscle, what are the health promoting effects of resistance training that the fringers, if you want, people on the fringe, tend to be able to benefit from beyond just like, oh, changes in muscle size and strength?
Yeah. I mean, from resistance training, you're getting, obviously bone mineral density, bone mineral content. So reduction in risk of not only osteoporosis, which is kind of like, bone loss, but also reduced risk of falls and fracture. So that's huge. You can think of your muscles as like a sponge for sugar. So in reduced risk of metabolic dysfunction just from having a bigger sink, for that. There's also a number of beneficial, we'll call them indirect effects of not only having more muscle tissue, but making that muscle tissue active. We know that muscles release hormones called myokines, and they are generally anti-inflammatory. They also, which are subsequently involved in reducing risk of cancer, for example, reducing risk of neurodegenerative diseases, also reducing the burden of people who already have some of these conditions. And so, yeah, there's just effectively every organ system in the body benefits from not only having some more muscle tissue up to a point, of course, but also from using those muscles. And you want to use them in multiple different ways. You want to make sure that your muscles can produce a lot of force quickly, slowly, for extended efforts, for short efforts, all that sort of stuff, if you're building this general base of physical development. But you also want to be able to have the cardiorespiratory system to be robust enough to make sure that you can continue to do these things for long periods of time. And so, yeah, you can get a lot of additional benefits from not only training, right, just the act of participating, but and also building muscle that are directly related to performance. You're stronger, faster, jump higher, whatever. But effectively, the having all of this muscle and using it just really helps build your physical 401k. And so I think maybe one of the more interesting sort of connections to not only strength training, the act of participating in it, but also having additional muscle mass is this concept of like a physiological reserve, such that if you were to get sick, if you were to have a traumatic injury that immobilized you or whatever, if you don't have that physical 401k that's well funded, oh boy, there's only so much credit that you can be extended before, your risk of premature death goes up or severe complication goes up. And so, basically every organ system in the body will benefit from resistance training. And I'll say the same thing about conditioning. They'll just benefit in different ways. And so you got to do both. You got to do both. I don't know what else to say other than like, if possible, should do both.
Yeah. And for resistance training, I know we've hammered on prescribing training, for lifting weights. For this is episode maybe 299. So for 298, we've hammered on
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
As far as, and I asked, again, these are questions I asked Dr. Michael Roberts, but I feel like you provide a really unique and very valuable perspective. What's the uh, point of diminishing returns with lifting weights and then also putting on muscle to where it's like,
Mm,
it's not that you're wasting your time. It's just that you shouldn't realize, like, you shouldn't expect, oh, my health is going to be even better if
yeah,
I
yeah.
put on another 10 pounds of muscle or lift another day per week.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it is an answerable question, or I guess should say that differently. It will be an answerable question at some point. So here's some interesting stuff that's just recently come up in the literature. Like we've always known, I say always, in this century, we've known that resistance training at least twice per week, leads to all these benefits in health. And then part of that's directly from being more physically active, and part of it's from actually building more muscle, more better functioning muscle, and so on and so forth. Where that sort of peters out is unknown.
Uh,
Um, we this interesting thing in the research that's happened though is that it's not just the act of doing the exercise, but it is in the response to the exercise, meaning that the people who get stronger from a given training intervention, given resistance training intervention, the people who gain more muscle mass from a particular training intervention, they tend to have better health proxies
uh,
than those who do not respond as robustly. So, for example, people who saw the biggest improvement in their one rep max on average have the biggest decrease in their resting blood pressure.
oh,
People who see the biggest increase in their one rep max leg press tend to see the biggest decrease in their fasting blood sugar. And so, the way I conceptually think about this is that there's a Venn diagram from like fitness or performance related adaptations and then health related adaptations. And in the middle, there's this overlap. And I think that the area where they overlap is like shared processes for generating those adaptations.
uh,
And so I think when I see somebody who responds really well to a program, that is not just for performance, but also for like some of these health related processes. And on the other hand, if you see somebody who doesn't respond very well, that just means the program's probably not really well suited to them, whether that's for their what they
uh,
need from a program, their existing fitness level, it's a mismatch, something like that. But ultimately, you would want people to do a resistance training program that not only they can adhere to, but also actually makes them better. So stronger, gain some muscle mass, improve power, and whatever. And so the upper limit of like where that starts to trail off, I can't tell you.
uh,
I mean, I can make a ridiculous comparison where it's like, yeah, look, taking your back squat from, look, I can barely do the bar to 225, likely to improve your health. But taking your back squat from 225 to 600 is probably diminishing returns fairly early on in that trajectory. Is it 300 pounds? Is it, it's probably lower than that. It's probably lower than that.
wow.
But I still do think the act of participating in the resistance training has some direct effect. And the act of you doing enough resistance training that actually is making you better continues to have some level of improvement. The interesting thing here to me is that those improvements in health from this, like, doing more than twice weekly resistance training, because most people are going to need more training volume to actually keep getting better. I think those improvements in health are generally smaller than
Uh,
if someone were to take that same amount of time and dedicate it to more conditioning. I just think there's a bigger sort of upside to doing more conditioning and improving your cardiorespiratory fitness past a certain point compared to getting stronger past a certain point or doing more resistance training. Obviously, individuals are going to vary on that. Somebody who's, frankly sarcopenic, right? So low amount of muscle mass, poor muscle function, their quality of life is going to massively improve far more from doing more resistance training than conditioning. But before that, if you consider like a generally healthy person who's looking to age well and, and keep a high degree of function, they'd probably be better served by doing more conditioning compared to more lifting. Yeah, that's kind of where it is interesting, but it's like, where's the upper limit? I don't know that it exists, but if I had to make a stock recommendation, like physical activity guidelines say twice per week resistance training, 150 minutes at least of moderate to vigorous conditioning, I think double that is probably going to capture 90 something percent of folks as far as, look, you've maxed out your benefits from
yeah.
exercise. It's going to get there. Uh, with the caveat, like I still think you could do more cardio on top of that and probably still see some benefits. It just wouldn't be very, very big for most folks. Maybe, and you can comment on this. I actually would try to get your take on this. I know you're supposed to be asking me questions, but something I've been pondering.
Yeah.
If somebody were to do even more exercise than that, they're lifting weights 4 times per week, hour and a half per session. So really getting after it, 6 hours per week of lifting weights. And they're doing 6 hours a week of conditioning, right? And they're like, should I do more for health? If they did, is it actually an improvement in fitness that would be potentially changing their trajectory? Or is it because they don't have enough time in their week to do anything that's like harmful to them, right? They have this big energy throughput. They're using a ton of energy every single day to exercise in some fashion. And that's taken away from the potential energy to do other stuff, not only metabolically, right? But also like, bro, I'm just tired. I can't go out drinking. I can't get into recreational drugs because I got to sleep. For example, I can't engage in these risky behaviors because I'm training all the time, right? So I do wonder like what sort of other things we may be overlooking when people are training at that high of a level.
Yeah. I wonder, that's a great question. And, I think we take for granted this like triangulation of health behaviors when we get into lifting weights. It's like I gravitated, I pretty much moved from, very risky health behaviors to, okay, I'm going to track my macros and I'm going to lift weights and I'm going to prioritize, sleep. And we dress it up as, oh yeah, I want to recover to train hard, but they're all just behaviors that actually end up being like net positive
Yep.
in the long term. And you kind of see that process play out to where you go from kind of getting introed to it to, now it's like, okay, I would like to get 8 hours plus of sleep per night. I would like to like not drink excessively. I would like to not do recreational. It's like, okay, we ended a point that you look to, I say maximize, it's not realistically, it's not what it is, but like take advantage of a lot of the things that are going to lead to, you call it a health span. I don't know how you,
Yeah.
like a healthier, more well-being experience of kind of what's going on right now. And I don't know why that tends to happen, why people tend to converge. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that either, but
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just ultimately like one positive behavior tends to beget an associated behavior that, in this case, ends up being also positive, right? Because you have to. You don't have a choice. Like if you want to train that much, like
yeah,
you got to make the.
that's true.
You're
That's a good point. Yeah, yeah.
you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and in this case, Peter was the the guy selling Coke on the corner. No, anyway. Are you familiar with Dr. Herman Ponzer? He's the constrained energy expenditure guy. He
I
wrote the
think
book
I
Burn.
listened to the podcast you did one. Yeah.
Yeah. So his for folks who haven't read his book Burn, which is a great book, and he's got another book. I think it's Adaptable. Great reads. We did a podcast with him. I'm fangirling a little bit. I really enjoyed that podcast. But his idea with exercise was that like past a certain point of exercise, you're not really increasing the amount of energy that you're using in a day.
Mm.
It's just you're kind of capped, right? So sure, if you go from like very like insufficiently active, that's a kind way of saying sedentary, but you go from somebody who's doing no exercise and then they go up to doing the physical activity guideline minimums. Yes, they're going to expend some amount of additional energy to do all of that stuff. But if they kept going up and up and more and more and more and more, and they're running a marathon, for example, it's not proportional. It's not directly additive. There's a serious compensation that happens within the body's metabolic processes to use less energy for other stuff so that you can have enough energy to exercise. And his theory here with respect to how exercise may directly improve health is that because you're using all of this energy, all of these calories to exercise, you don't have all these calories to build a tumor, to
Oh, wow.
cause inflammatory processes, to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, yeah, you're almost starving these nefarious processes of the requisite energy that you need. And so you don't get them. And I do wonder how that transfers over to like behaviors, right? You're starving your body's ability to have enough energy to engage in maybe risky behaviors by doing all of these positive ones. And so, anyway, that's a little. Look, this is a philosophical podcast, so we gotta go into some of this. But
Yeah.
I do think about that quite often.
What I think to, give you another kind of shout for the work you do, when you see, so it's like you get into lifting, you consume material related to the things you're directly interested in. That happens to be coupled with something else. You happen to then consume the other things. So it's like I see Barbell Medicine. It's like, okay, I'm really focused on performance. Oh, they have a health band. Oh, maybe that's something I should think about. And you just happen to then bleed into uncharted territories, and then they tend to be more understood and well known. And then you can kind of shape how you prioritize venturing to those other places. So I think that totally makes sense. And with respect to cardio, I mentioned that on the resistance training side, um, programming has been kind of beaten dead and beyond.
298 episodes, yeah, man.
But with cardio, we really haven't touched on the prescription component. And I know that if I do a heavy single in the squat, and that's the only training I get for the squat in that day, that might be different from, say, a 10 by 10. And there might be different adaptations and different outcomes. With cardio, how much does the application in terms of the formulation of the training itself? So let's do a bike for 60 minutes at this effort level, dictate the adaptations. And then how does that influence health ultimately?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And so, it's interesting. You look at the physical activity guidelines, and for cardio, they are at a minimum do 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. That's, they say aerobic exercise. We'll come back to that in a second. Or you could do 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic exercise, or some combination of the two. A couple problems here. One, what the heck does moderate to vigorous mean? What does vigorous mean? And so, look, these are researchers, and so they put together this nice little metric that they call metabolic equivalence. And so at rest, you're using about it's a 1 met activity when you're just sitting there doing nothing. And then this scales with the increased amount of metabolic demand, so energy use, as it goes up and up and up. So walking at a much slower pace than your normal gait is like a 2 met activity. Walking at your typical gait, which is right around 3 miles an hour for most folks, give or take, that's about a 2.8 to 3 met activity. Sprinting can be a 10 met activity or whatever. And so yeah, we'll use mets. And then you ask a doctor, like, hey, what's a metabolic equivalent? How does that translate to actual exercise? I'm like, I don't know. You ask a person in the public, hey man, what's a metabolic equivalent? Like, what, a metabolic what? That doesn't make any sense. So just silly recommendation, in my opinion. And then they call it aerobic exercise, but later say, oh no, but it could be anaerobic, intervals, for example. So it's a mess. The whole thing's a mess, right? So let's simplify here. I do think that the guideline minimums are reasonable, mainly because I think that they're achievable for many. And I also think that the 150 minutes, we'll call it, of just cardio, whether that's low and slow, whether it's high intensity interval, whatever, I think that is a reasonable target because there's a robust amount of evidence suggesting that dose, that volume load of training really does get people a lot of the way there towards, quote, maximizing their health benefits from exercise. There's more to have if you keep going, for sure. But that's going to get people a lot of the way there. So as far as how you think about the type of programming, the type of prescription, the formulation of that, and the type of adaptations that you're going to get, it's the same thing you see in resistance training, that the intensity of the effort determines the type of adaptations that you're going to get, and the volume determines the magnitude of the adaptations that you're going to get. So for example, intensity, we talk about doing moderate intensity continuous training, classically known as low and slow. We're talking about steady state aerobic training. This is like zone 1, zone 2. If you use a 5-zone model, so somewhere between 60 and 80% of your max heart rate, that's kind of that area. This would also be considered moderate to vigorous physical activity per the guidelines. Those adaptations are generally going to be with respect to how much blood you're carrying, how many red blood cells you have going on. the ability of the body to mitochondrial density, things of that nature, capillarization in the muscles, things of that nature. And then when you get really, really high intensity, so zone 4, zone 5, we're talking about threshold type training, VO2 max level training. These would generally be done as either very high intensity aerobic intervals, so very fast pace stuff, or it could even be sprints, right? Sprint intensity training, that'd be like zone 5. Those things are going to be more related to lactate clearance, using lactate to create more energy, lactate buffering, these sort of systems that allow a person to go a little faster and hold on to that just a little bit longer, or be able to repeat that effort. And so it's not that you want one over the other, you want both. You
Yeah.
want both. And so if I was given the option to create the perfect conditioning plan for an individual, I'd expose them to both. Not necessarily with even sort of amounts. If in a perfect world, I'd say, look, we're going to have you do 3 hours per week, so 180 minutes of cardio. And 80% of that is going to be moderate intensity, low and slow type stuff. Again, 65% to 80% max heart rate. Could be on a bike, could be, running, jogging, could be on a Stairmaster, rower, skier. Pick the modality of your choice. Ideally, I'd pick multiple modalities, because a lot of the adaptations that specialists end up getting are directly related to the activity they do the most, right? Lance Armstrong's VO2 max, back when he was a cyclist, was much higher on a bike than it would be on a treadmill, for example. And so, yeah, he was Tour de France cyclist. Of course, that makes total sense. But for your average person who just wants to be healthier, I would prefer doing multiple different modalities, right? Build this broad physical base, get adaptations across a wide variety of activities, also avoid the use like overuse injury type stuff that people might get from doing all their stuff running, doing all their stuff on a bicycle, doing all their stuff on a rower. So of the 180 minutes, 80% of it would be low and slow, and then the rest would be higher intensity type training. And so when people say HIIT, high intensity interval training, this is another like definitions issue. What does that actually mean? So if we agreed that zone 1 and zone 2, 60 to 80% max heart rate, we call that moderate to vigorous physical activity. That it's moderate, right? Anything above that is going to be high intensity, and intervals just means it's not continuous. So you could do high intensity continuous training. That'd be like zone 3. So tempo training, right? Or it could be intervals. You could do that broken up, so non-continuous. Could be high intensity interval training. But when people say HIIT, they just think sprint training. But that's its own sort of thing, sprint intensity training. That's usually faster, shorter period of time. But anyway, about 20% of a person's training would be higher intensity something. And so this doesn't have to be a separate session. Sometimes I'll have people do like 40 minutes on a bike, heart rate somewhere between 70 and 80% of your max heart rate. And at the end, you're going to do a 10-minute EMOM, 10 seconds max effort, 8 seconds max effort, and then chill for the rest of the minute. Do that again for 10 minutes. Just a little exposure. In running, it'd be like strides. You're just fast at the end. Sometimes if people are like, I really don't want to do like 5 cardio sessions per week to do this 180 minutes total, I'd rather just do like 3 long ones. In the middle of one of those maybe 60-minute sessions, I'd have them do some strides in the middle or sprints in the middle, mostly for like a vigilance and like vibe check. Like, hey man, wake up. You got to get it together. So, but I think that would be my general recommendation for like a baseline, somewhere right around 3 hours per week of cardio. 80% of that's low and slow. Somewhere again, 60 to 80% of your max heart rate. Pick a wide variety of modalities, and then some exposure to higher intensity stuff. If you want it to be formal cardio on a bike, on a rower, on a ski erg, that's fine. If you wanted to push a sled, drag a sled, that's fine. The main thing is that if the force production requirements get high enough, it's going to start to look a lot more like resistance training, and those are the adaptations that you're going to get. So I wouldn't really recommend CrossFit for this. I wouldn't really recommend most strongman training for this. And so the litmus test, and this is admittedly a little bro sciencey, but I think it works in practice. If you're feeling your muscles fatigue faster or primarily compared to your lungs, it's probably anaerobic, and you're starting to err towards more like resistance training type adaptations. If it's mostly lungs and you're not feeling your muscles like burn or whatever, it's probably more conditioning based. And so we're trying to decidedly do more conditioning based stuff here. And so the last little wrinkle in this, and I'll let you ask the next question or shift the conversation, is for lifters, we're already doing so much dang lactate level work, that even in some of the zone models, right? You've heard of the 5-zone model. Well, there's like an 8-zone model in resistance training, zone 8, right? We're doing a lot of that already. I don't know that you actually need the exposure to the higher intensity stuff outside of like, I have a performance related goal related to conditioning. I want to run a mile in X speed. So you're going to have to do some speed work, right? I want to row a 5K in under 20 minutes. Well, you're going to need some sort of developmental work. But if not, if it's just for health, you could do it all low and slow, and that's fine too. Shit, I said there was one more wrinkle. This is the final wrinkle, I swear to you. If somebody's hearing this and they're like, 180 minutes, are you crazy? That's 3 hours a week, dude. No way. I'm giving you an hour tops.
Yeah.
Fine. Low and slow is probably not the move there because it's not enough volume load to generate the amount of adaptations that we want for cardiorespiratory fitness. In that case, I would probably rely more heavily on high intensity interval training, so zone 3, zone 4, and some sprint intensity training, provided there's no like injury risk thing that I'm, absolutely 0 out of 10 cannot afford any increased risk. And so that's just for people who are time limited. They're like, how much zone 2 cardio should I do? And I'm like, you can do some, but I probably want you to do more higher intensity stuff just to get all of these adaptations. And admittedly, that's probably a little bit higher risk than doing the low and slow stuff. But I'll tell you this, when you look at the research on this, it's not like people are dropping like flies in all these high intensity interval training studies. They do generally fine, right? Yeah. And so it's like, and those protocols are far harder than what I'm advocating for. So anyway, that's kind of like my baseline recommendation. And if people can get there, I'm happy. I'm pumped. And if they ask, well, what's next? I'm like, cool, let's try to double it. How do we get up to that over the next couple of years? It's just going to take a while. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. I just think like, if you have the time to train and you have the physiological tolerance for that amount of training load, you should take advantage of it. And if not, then we got to work up to it.
Yeah. And obviously you mentioned intensity being a critical factor here. It's like you can't just, walk for 60 minutes and expect the adaptations to be similar to, zone 2 or zone 3 level intensity training for that same duration. But how much would baseline physical activity, and by baseline just the amount of movement per day, dictate those recommendations, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, philosophical weightlifting podcast, a little philosophy, like, okay, what officially counts as exercise? Yeah. And what is exercise? What does that really mean? Where's the line in the sand we draw between like physical activity, so non-exercise activity, to exercise activity? And so admittedly, there's no perfect answer here. People have said, oh, it's 60% of your VO2 peak or 55%, 60% of your max heart rate. A number of different like thresholds have popped up, but there's no consensus on this. And ultimately, I don't know that I have a great answer for this as far as like research says this, that, the other. I do think that walking for most people probably counts as exercise.
Okay.
Because your self-selected pace is right at that sort of threshold for like it costs enough energy to no longer be just general physical activity. It's exercise, right? Yeah. It's right at, and so is that 4 METs, something like that? Is your heart rate like 60% of your max heart rate, somewhere around there? If you can do that by walking, great. We'll call it zone 1 on a 5-zone model. We'll call it moderate intensity conditioning. That's fine. So some people can do that. A brisk walk probably is going to take care of that for most folks. The bigger issue here is that we're so good at walking. We're so economical at walking. The actual energy throughput for that is less than cycling, less than a Stairmaster, less than a rower or whatever at the same intensity. But you're exactly right. The person who's just using walking, brisk walking even, is not going to get the same amount of cardiorespiratory adaptations and performance related adaptations for a conditioning piece than somebody who's like, I'm regimented, I'm doing my zone 2, I'm getting some exposure to zone 3, zone 4, maybe a little sprint interval stuff. The performance is going to be the bigger thing that suffers. Yeah, there's might be some difference in VO2 max, but in longevity, that'd be really tough. It'd be
Huh.
really tough for me to confidently say. It goes back to that idea I brought up earlier, where there's new research showing the people who get strongest from a resistance training intervention tend to have the better health outcomes. So, do people who have a more robust VO2 max response to a given cardio intervention, do they have a better sort of health trajectory? We don't really know,
Huh.
because that hasn't been studied longitudinally. So, like long term, we have cross-sectional data that showing that people with higher VO2 maxes tend to have less incidence, lower risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain types of cancer, and so on. But I don't know that small differences from exercise, like the small differences in VO2 max from different exercise protocols, actually changes the trajectory. My hunch, yeah, probably. I just don't know. I can't say it confidently. So I know that's not satisfying, but yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think the question then ends up the question that ends up stemming from that for me tends to be or would be knowing that conditioning is like a critical component of a health promoting like physical activity regimen. And we should do, per your recommendation, call it 180 minutes per week, at this, XYZ intensity level for this much and that much based on what you said previously in the podcast. And knowing that the audience lifts weights pretty frequently, I call it 3 to 5 days per week. Some people
Yep.
do maybe doing double days if they're feeling like it. They're wondering, and I'm wondering, how do I stagger that around my weight room work?
Mm.
Not so, maybe it is so it doesn't impact it. It probably is so it doesn't impact it, but also so it's like not, okay, now I'm doing something 7 days per week, 60 minutes per day plus, because those weight room sessions are going to be, 90 to 120 minutes.
Yep.
So from an time efficiency standpoint, but also you mentioned the interference effect from the standpoint of it interrupting the weight room adaptations. How can we best implement conditioning and cardio?
Yeah, I mean, in an optimal world, you'd have unlimited time resources, and you'd finish the workout, you'd go home, you'd eat, you'd take a nap, and then a few hours later, you'd do some conditioning, right? And then you'd have no stressors. You'd go to bed and sleep 8 hours. That's in a perfect world. Yeah, I think there's probably some benefit to splitting your resistance training session and your cardio session. I would, outside of an endurance application, I would almost always do resistance training first in the day, for a strength athlete, for sure. For an endurance athlete, that's not always the case. Obviously sometimes the endurance work, the sport specific work is going to take precedent. But yeah, for a strength athlete, for somebody who's interested in that, barbell sport athlete, yeah, your resistance training session takes priority. So if you can separate the sessions, ideally with like a meal in between,
Huh.
um, great, do that. And if you want to do 20 to 30 minutes of, if it's a brisk walk, if it's on the bike and you're, 70 to 80% of your max heart rate, you're on the rower, ski erg, or whatever, all good. I'm pumped on that. If you want to do it directly after your session, that's fine too. If you want to, after your resistance training session is done, your lifting session is done, you do, a handful of 10-minute bouts, 5-minute bouts of conditioning that ultimately total to 150, 180 minutes per week. Thumbs up, you get a gold star, pass go, collect your $200. All of those things are viable. It ultimately comes down to scheduling and preferences. To
Right.
me personally, I do almost all of my conditioning work directly after I'm done training. I do the last set, finish, clean up my spot, and I go start doing the conditioning, mostly from a time perspective. I'm like, this is my time to work out. I'm working out. And then I'm done and dusted after that. And if that works for somebody, great. And if they want to split it up, also great. Not a huge deal. There's just many different ways to achieve that total training volume of, we'll call it 150 to 180 minutes per week. You can do it in short sessions, you can do it in longer sessions, fewer sessions, more sessions. If I had a hunch as far as what I think works best, I think longer sessions work better than shorter sessions for improving cardiorespiratory fitness, meaning that if I was comparing 3 hour long sessions to whatever the equivalent dose is of 5 minute sessions, I think that the 60-minute sessions are likely to work better because they expose the body to that bottleneck of supplying the active muscle tissue with oxygenated blood, removing waste products, whatever, for a longer period of time, a more sustained period of time. And the body gets the signal. It's like, hey, man, adapt, brother. Whereas 5 minutes, it's hard to get your heart rate up in that period of time. And ultimately, it's over before it started. Not that it's bad. Can be health promoting, can improve cardiorespiratory fitness, absolutely. And so ultimately, that's better. That's certainly better than not doing any. I just would, if in a perfect world, longer sessions separated from your resistance training, that would be ideal in my mind. But we're majoring in the minors at that point. I do think that lifters who are concerned with the interference effect, the best way to conceptualize this is we're just adding training volume to your program is what we're doing. And so similar to, doubling your squat volume, doubling your pull volume, your bench volume, your, jerk volume, whatever it is. Yeah, we're adding more volume with conditioning. And so the real interference effect isn't like molecularly speaking, the signaling. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, your training volume is much higher now. And if you are not ready right now to adapt to those demands, you might see a decrease in performance and training adaptation for a short period of time until you are up to snuff. And so for a person where performance in a session is mission critical, cannot tolerate a decrease in performance. If I'm wanting to go to 180 minutes, that's where I'm wanting to get to. Start at 60 minutes per week. Do that for 3 or 4 weeks, then bump it up to 100 minutes per week. Do that for another few weeks, bump it up. Just gradually progress to that point. And I suspect that person is going to see very little, if any, interference effect at all, only because you've given the body a chance to adapt to the higher training load. Again, same way you wouldn't with the squat volume, like, we're doubling it next week. Generally would not be advised. And so I probably wouldn't do that for conditioning either. Again, for a person who's very, very concerned with their resistance training performance.
Yeah. And I think it's an important point for all the coaches listening, not to take their subject matter expertise, which is strength power, and then completely throw that out the window with conditioning, where they're like,
Totally.
okay, well, I'll just do 150 minutes right away. Cause I would probably do that and be like, holy shit, I'm shot from that. Instead of like, oh, I'll just do 15 minutes casual and kind of build up slowly, like intro weeks and loading, more work phases.
Program it. Yeah. When you think about adding sets, like, okay, we're doing that, but we're doing it with cardio. We're just adding some sets. And so, get there progressively. I think that's reasonable. It's easy. This whole thing's easier to do with a fresh slate. Like, oh, brand new person's never exercised. Well, great. There's no competing interests, right? That's super easy. It's harder to do with somebody who's like, look, I've been training like this lifting wise for a decade. And now you want to introduce this other thing. I'm like, let's go low and slow. Let's gradually build up to it.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think this was an incredible episode of the podcast to explore a lot of the aspects of physical activity, resistance training, conditioning, and health. The question I would have, the kind of like ultimate question that would put a bow on this basically, is you have someone now who resistance trains, someone who does cardio. They probably have a lot of associated health promoting behaviors kind of under their belt. They sleep well. They try and regulate themselves from an emotional standpoint. They're surrounded by people who care about them. They're trying to accomplish all these things that would lead to the most fulfilled life that they can possibly lead. More philosophically, like a good life. What's the last piece of advice you give them to help, I guess, bring it all together? Right? Like, what would you say to someone who's kind of gotten most of their checks and balances figured out?
Yeah, from a physical standpoint, like physical development, if we're just focused on that, I would say pick a sport that you don't play. It's not related to barbells, and get exposed to that. Whether look, if you're a guy like me in my age demographic, it's got to be MMA. It seems like that's the pipeline, right? From like a washed up powerlifter to MMA athlete. But whether it's pick up basketball, whatever, anything like that, it's just you're gonna learn. Your body's going to learn a totally different way to move, deal with, a non-sterile sort of environment to adapt to. And same sort of thing though. Don't go from I've done no sports training to I'm doing MMA. I'm rolling 3 days a week. Like you're just adding training volume. So
Yeah.
anyway, I think from a physical standpoint, I would recommend some sort of sport, which is can be interesting. Obviously not before a meet, but otherwise general physical development that would be interesting. And then from like this, again, it's a philosophical podcast. So like we're talking about feelings and, what is the meaning of life? What are we doing
Yeah.
here? What's the purpose? I would try to find some way to engage in like a mentorship type of thing, especially if you've been doing this for a while or have lived, circled the sun a number of times. Yeah, or the sun circled you. Yeah, anyway. I would try to some sort of volunteer thing where you are in a mentorship role or leadership role. Like that would be, I think, just very fulfilling from like a personal development standpoint. So play a sport, volunteer. I don't know. I mean, other than that, like who am I? I don't know what to tell you. Like just vibe after
Just
that. At that
vibe.
point, yeah, just vibe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just chill. No, that was a fantastic answer, and one that was very thoughtful. And I think a lot of people could probably benefit from having some perspective outside of just lifting weights and pounding the pavement or getting on a bike or a treadmill.
Totally.
And I think the mentor part, it's that Daniel Dennett quote. It's like you can't imagine what you don't know. So it's like bringing in new input, right? Being able to kind of bring in new stimuli. To keep you thinking about things in a novel and interesting way. Is if people are interested in perusing the content you've been putting out, the work you've been doing for a very, very, very long time now, where can they go to check it out?
Yeah, that was great. Pretty much all social media platforms, Barbell Medicine. You can search that. We're on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, podcast. You can search by the same name, Barbell Medicine, Facebook group. We got a forum. That's where we answer, Dr. Baraki and I answer questions there regularly. So you navigate through our website, barbellmedicine.com. Articles, free resources, all that sort of stuff is there. And if you want to get in touch with us for either consultation, coaching, anything like that, support at barbellmedicine.com. Happy to help you out.
If the people listening say they're going to give you one piece of, information that they're going to check out, one article they're going to read,
Oh man.
one podcast, one book, where would you direct them? The one
Sure,
thing that
yeah.
you kind of would recommend to them. Yeah.
For people that are performance minded, I think our progressive loading article and or podcast by the same name, we have two of them, progressive loading, not progressive overload, because I think words do matter and how that implements, how often you add weight to the bar, add reps to your set, stuff like that. For performance minded stuff, I would definitely check that out. For people who are more interested in like injury rehab stuff, the three biggest mistakes you're making in your rehab, 10 out of 10 would recommend. And then for people that are health minded and like, bro, just give me the 10,000 foot view on health and what I need to be doing for that. 7 health priorities. That article on our website. Also have a podcast for that as well. So those are my top 3, my greatest hits.
Yeah, awesome. I'll make sure all that's in the show notes as one does with podcasts. If people are interested in further checking out all the information I release, it's philosophicalweightlifting.com, at philosophicalweightlifting on Instagram, Josh_Phil WL for my personal account. Thanks to everyone for listening to another great episode of the podcast, and we will catch you all next week.